Welcome to another week in politics with Michelle Grattan. My name's Mark Evans. I'm Director of the Institute for Governance and your host for this morning's conversation. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Mark.
Well, I see you've been really active this week, out and about in Wentworth. Things look to be warming up nicely for the by-election. Originally, we thought that Kerryn Phelps was going to be a real contender in the by-election. That's Kerryn Phelps, the independent, but she seems to have muddled up on the preferences a bit. What's your view on how she's going in the by-election?
Look, Mark, it's really hard to tell. It's one of those contests where what's important is whether Kerryn Phelps finishes second or third on the primary votes. Now, if she finishes second, she will get preferences from Labor and some other candidates, and that really puts her in the race. If she finishes under Labor, then the Liberal candidate will win. She's preferencing him, and it'll be essentially, I think, a no contest. I don't think Labor would have any chance of taking the seat. But we haven't had much polling. As you mentioned, Kerryn Phelps didn't start well in the campaign. She sent out a whole lot of mixed messages or changed messages on preferences, and I think that's enabled the Liberal Party really to hit her fairly hard, even though it's getting her preferences in the final iteration.
So a lot of commentators were thinking that the Wentworth by-election was going to be kind of a barometer for who was going to win the federal election, but it doesn't seem to be quite working that way. Why is that, do you think?
I don't think it's a barometer, but I do think it will be important in the contest. We've still got a new Prime Minister, of course. He's relatively new, weeks only into the office. It's the first real-time test for Scott Morrison, and if he did lose this seat, it's traditionally a Liberal seat, although the majorities have varied over the various elections. If he did lose it, it would be a significant knock. So it's a very important contest. And of course, if the Liberals lost the seat, they would lose their majority in the House of Representatives. Now, that doesn't mean the government would fall, but it does mean it would make it much harder to do things, to get legislation through.
And are there any signs that ScoMo, the man of the people, is making inroads? Because his whole style clearly, in a sense, has been defined against the criticisms of Turnbull, that Turnbull didn't reach out and connect in a way that he should do with everyday Australians.
Well, that's right. In a wider sense, I think that people are seeing him as having more cut through than Malcolm Turnbull. In Wentworth, of course, the position is much more complicated because people have lost a member that they were quite attached to, and there's some resentment, a lot of resentment, I think, about that. On the other hand, there are some people critical of Malcolm Turnbull for pulling the plug early. But what's happened in the last day is that Malcolm Turnbull's son, Alex, who's an investment banker in Singapore, has entered the contest with a video saying people should vote against the Liberals, and that the extreme right of the Liberal Party has taken over the party, that people should use this opportunity to send a message to the government on climate change. So this is a pretty strong intervention, and of course this is one that could do some damage to the Liberals at this stage of the election, which is just a week out from polling day.
So are we now seeing through Alex what his father really thinks in policy terms, do you think?
I think he would say that he's his own man. He's, after all, in his 30s. He's not just reflecting his father, but I think his father would be not unhappy to see this intervention, put it that way.
And what's the Labour campaign looking like in Wentworth? Have they got a strong presence?
The Labor campaign is interesting because the Labor candidate, I think, is quite popular, is going over well. He's lived there for a very long time, so he's personally known and is doing probably quite well, seen quite positively. But Labor does not want to come second in this race. For the reasons that I mentioned before. So Labor's putting no resources into the campaign, and when I was there earlier in the week, Bill Shorten hadn't even appeared in the electorate at that stage. So Labor is sort of running dead, but isn't as dead as it might want to be.
Yeah, it's a kind of a tactical withdrawal.
That's right.
So it looks like it's going to be really tight then. But your sense at the moment is maybe Liberals by a narrow margin, you think?
I think the talk has been that the Liberals are favourite. Now, I think it's always dangerous in by-elections to be too predictive because obviously big swing is expected. But certainly Anthony Green, the ABC analyst, who's pretty good on these matters, I think his feeling is that Kerryn Phelps really has an uphill battle, and that the preference issue made that slope even steeper.
Now, another major news story has come to the fore this week, and a very, very interesting one from my perspective, because it draws out those key issues around church and state. A leak from the report by the Ruddock inquiry into religious freedom, what's caused quite a stir. At the centre of the storm was a section about the right of religious schools to discriminate against LGBT students and teachers. So how difficult an issue is this going to be for the government, both in the Wentworth by-election and beyond?
It is difficult. It's come at a bad time in the by-election. Kerryn Phelps, of course, was a strong campaigner on the marriage vote, and so she can exploit that quite effectively. More generally, I think that it's difficult for the government. Now, present legislation does allow this discrimination, and actually the thrust of the Ruddock report on this matter is really to codify the use of that discrimination, if you want to put it that way, and to put some limits around it, say there must be a public policy by the school and so on. But of course it's come out in a rather different framing, and now there's a debate not just about whether you have a new provision codified in that way, but whether the existing law that allows the discrimination should be got rid of entirely and nothing replace it. So in a sense the government is under pressure from the right to keep the discrimination, from the left to get rid of it, and the whole issue, I think, is going to be hard to handle. Now, the government's sitting on the report. It's sat on it since May. Scott Morrison says it will be released before Christmas with a response, but this issue is an irritant and possibly worse for the government just when it really needs to be clearing away things, not entering new difficult controversies.
Yeah, this is a fascinating issue. I mean, for the benefit of educating me and for our viewers as well, can you give us a sense basically about how much influence you think the private school sector, and particularly the church school sector, has over the Liberal Party and the government?
I think the Catholic school sector has a great deal of influence, and not just over the Liberal Party. The Labor Party, when it originally introduced the Gonski measures, made special deals for the Catholic sector. Malcolm Turnbull tried to get rid of the special deals. He came under enormous pressure and attack from the Catholic schools, and of course we've seen the Morrison government recalibrate the education funding to provide more money for the Catholic schools. If Malcolm Turnbull had survived, he would have done the same. So the influence is pretty great.
So that must always be a big sort of moral dilemma for prime ministers of a religious orientation, mustn't it? Especially if they're socially liberal. So they're looking to make progressive education reforms, but at the same time they have some sort of religious allegiance to that sector. I remember Rudd being in sort of the same situation as well. Was that the case?
I think that in general what you're saying is right. I think on the question of this discrimination, though, it is rather different from the education money question. Right. I think that the sector has, the churches have more influence on the money front, because obviously that's something that so many parents would feel strongly about. When it comes to this discrimination question, then there are other influences also at work. So it's a more competitive environment, if you like.
Fascinating. Back to the election now then. We're obviously seeing a government that's starting to fine-tune the economy prior to the election. Scott Morrison has announced that the government will fast-track the company tax cuts for small and medium businesses. So how difficult, and obviously that's a quick shift, so how difficult it is going to be for Labour to respond to that shift ahead of the election?
That shift, incidentally, has come after the defeat of the, or failure to get through the company tax cuts for big business, which the Senate just said not interested in. I think that it is an interesting position for Labor on the bringing forward of the cuts for the small businesses, and at the moment Bill Shorten is reserving Labor's position, so I think it's going to, over the next little while, because this legislation is going to come in quite quickly, it's going to be deciding whether it's best not to make a fight of this and just say, okay, we'd spend that money in that way, or say, no, we're going to draw a line here. I don't know which way they'll go, but certainly it's a dilemma, and it's one they've got to sort out fairly quickly.
So we're seeing both government and opposition starting to offer various sweeteners prior to the election, obviously Labour with the childcare package. Are there any other major sweeteners that you can expect emerging?
Oh, look, I think Labor will be throwing out policies like confetti at a wedding between now and Christmas. It's said that there are going to be a lot of policy announcements. The government has to counter, so given that the election can be as late as mid-May, it's quite amazing that not only are we in the sort of permanent election campaign we've become so used to, but we're getting all these policy announcements, multiple announcements sometimes in a week. It's just crazy.
But you're not expecting any sort of major intervention on, say, some of the big democracy issues after the whole leadership spill fiasco, and the fact that we do have this real profound problem with citizen trust. You don't think that there might be any big idea on the democratic reform front?
Look, they always say that politics should be better, that they'd like a nicer, more polite system, that they'd like things to work more effectively. Doesn't happen.
Yeah. So we're going to see more politics for the short term rather than the long term.
Yes, I think so. I don't think there's a lot of hope of major reform to the democratic system on the horizon.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's the end of this week's Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. We look forward to seeing you again next week.